My wife told me I feel no shame about years of affairs, so I walked out, exposed her manipulation, and let divorce courts set me truly free at last. All it took was 5 minutes while my wife was in the shower, humming that cheerful tune she always sang when she was in a good mood. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up with a notification. I wouldn't normally check her messages, but something had felt off for weeks. The constant late nights at work, the sudden password changes on her accounts, and the way she would angle her phone away whenever I entered the room. The message preview showed just enough. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My hands trembled as I picked up the device. To my surprise, it wasn't locked, a careless mistake on her part. What I found destroyed 10 years of trust in an instant. Not just intimate messages with a coworker, but screenshots of conversations with her friends where she mocked our marriage and called me boring and predictable. He has no idea she had written in one message, followed by laughing emojis. Sometimes I almost feel bad for him. Almost. I sat there numb, scrolling through months of deception, photos, hotel receipts, inside jokes at my expense. The bathroom door opened and steam billowed out as she walked into the living room wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping wet. She must have seen something in my expression because her smile faltered. When her eyes dropped to her phone in my hand, her face transformed. Not with guilt or remorse, but with annoyance at being caught. "What are you doing with my phone?" she demanded, snatching it away. I remained silent, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal I'd just uncovered. When I finally found my voice, I asked her calmly if what I had read was true. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she looked me straight in the eyes with a coldness I'd never seen before and uttered the words that would echo in my mind for months to come. "I feel no shame." The audacity stunned me. No apologies, no tears, just defiance, as if I were the one who had done something wrong by discovering her betrayal. "You were never enough," she continued, her voice eerily casual. "You should have known I needed more." Each word felt like a dagger. Not just because of the infidelity, but because of how little our decade together seemed to mean to her. I didn't shout. I didn't break down. Instead, I walked to our bedroom and pulled my suitcase from the closet. She followed me, suddenly changing her tone and asking what I was doing. The realization that I wouldn't simply accept her behavior seemed to catch her off guard. "You're overreacting," she said, her confidence wavering slightly as I methodically packed my essentials. That night became a strange battlefield of emotions. Her strategy shifted rapidly, from dismissive confidence to anger, then to half-hearted explanations that this was just physical and didn't mean anything. When those approaches failed, she attempted tears that seemed calculated rather than genuine. I recognized the manipulation tactics that had probably worked on me many times before, but my eyes were now painfully open. As midnight approached, she resorted to threats about what would happen if I left, how I would regret it, how no one would want me, how she would take everything in the divorce. I simply continued packing, adding important documents to my bag. The more I remained calm, the more frantic she became. By 3 o'clock in the morning, her smirk had completely vanished, replaced by genuine panic as she realized she was losing control of the situation. Dawn was breaking when I finished gathering what I needed. She stood in the doorway, blocking my exit, now fully in tears. "Please," she whispered. "We can work through this." But looking at her, I only remembered those cold eyes and the words, "I feel no shame." No amount of morning tears could erase the truth I had seen in that moment. Our marriage was already over. She had ended it long before I discovered her messages. I stepped around her and walked out the door, knowing with absolute certainty that I would never see our home the same way again. I spent that first night at a hotel downtown, staring at the ceiling as my phone continuously lit up with her messages and calls. They ranged from angry accusations to desperate pleas, a roller coaster of emotions that seemed entirely performative. I turned my phone to silent and tried to process what had happened. The numbness was wearing off, giving way to a pain so acute it felt physical. 10 years of memories were now tainted by doubt. How long had this been going on? Were there others before this man? Had anything in our relationship been genuine? Morning came, and with it a clarity I hadn't expected. I contacted my office and requested emergency personal leave. Then I called a locksmith to change the locks on my private home office, where I kept important financial documents. She wouldn't expect this move. She had always underestimated me. By noon, I had spoken with a divorce attorney who advised me to document everything and avoid confrontation that could be used against me later. "Your advantage is that she doesn't think you're capable of standing up for yourself," he said. "Use that." When I finally responded to her messages, I simply wrote that I needed space to think and would contact her when I was ready to talk. Her response was immediate and volatile, demanding I return home, threatening to call my parents, my friends, even my workplace. I recognized this as another control tactic and maintained my silence. She had always been the one who directed our narrative to family, to friends, even to me, but not anymore. 3 days passed before I returned to the house to collect more belongings. I timed it carefully, arriving when I knew she would be at work. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw her car. She had been waiting for me. The moment I opened the door, I saw how she had prepared. The house was immaculate. She was dressed in the outfit she had worn on our first date, hair and makeup perfectly done. Candles were lit, and the dining table was set with our wedding china, a performance designed to trigger nostalgia. "We need to talk," she said softly, her voice lacking the edge it had carried just days ago. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." I noticed how she maintained direct eye contact, something she had learned in her corporate negotiations. Every gesture was calculated. I stood in the entryway, not moving further into the house, not engaging with the scene she had created. This clearly wasn't what she expected. "I've also been thinking," I replied, "and I've concluded that I deserve honesty. How long has it been going on?" My directness seemed to throw her off balance. She tried to deflect, talking about how we had grown apart, how lonely she had felt. Classic blame shifting. I repeated my question, maintaining eye contact. After several attempts to change the subject, she finally admitted the affair had been going on for 7 months. But something in her expression told me there was more. And how many others were there before him? The question hung in the air. Her eyes widened slightly, a tell she couldn't control. The affair I had discovered wasn't the first transgression. It was simply the first time she had been caught. She attempted to redirect again, talking about problems in our marriage, my emotional unavailability, my long work hours. I remained silent, waiting. Finally, in frustration, she admitted there had been 2 others over the years. As she spoke, I recorded the conversation discreetly on my phone, as advised by my attorney. She didn't notice, too caught up in her own narrative of justification. 3 affairs over 10 years of marriage. Each revelation should have hurt, but instead it strengthened my resolve. This wasn't a momentary lapse or a single mistake. This was a pattern of deception that defined our entire relationship. When she finished speaking, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for me to beg for reconciliation or explode in anger, reactions she knew how to manipulate. Instead, I simply nodded and said, "Thank you for finally being honest. I'll have divorce papers drawn up." Her composure cracked. She was genuinely shocked by my response. This wasn't how our confrontations usually ended. As I moved through the house collecting my things, she followed, her tactics shifting rapidly between anger, seduction, and victimhood. She accused me of planning this all along, then minutes later suggested we could still salvage our physical relationship even if we divorced. When that failed, she collapsed on our bed in tears, saying she would have nowhere to go and no way to support herself, despite her 6-figure corporate salary. By the time I had packed what I needed, her mask had completely fallen away. Standing in the doorway, blocking my exit just as she had days before, she hissed, "You'll regret this. No one will ever want you like I did." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time saw the stranger behind the familiar face. "That's exactly what I'm counting on," I replied, walking past her and out of the house that had never truly been a home. The following week passed in a blur of legal consultations and paperwork. My attorney moved quickly, citing the documented infidelity as grounds for divorce. I provided the recordings and screenshots, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as he reviewed the evidence. "This is more than enough," he assured me. "She won't be able to claim alimony with this kind of misconduct." I felt no satisfaction, only a hollow relief that at least the legal process would be straightforward. I rented a small apartment across town, informed the bank of the impending divorce, froze our joint accounts, and secured my personal finances. These practical steps kept me functioning when grief threatened to overwhelm me. Each night I lay awake, replaying moments from our marriage, recognizing patterns I had missed, the business trips that ran mysteriously long, the gym sessions that never resulted in any physical changes, the passwords that changed regularly for security reasons. The signs had always been there. I had simply chosen not to see them. 12 days after my discovery, the divorce papers were delivered to her at the house. I wasn't present, but my attorney informed me she had accepted them without incident. That evening, my phone exploded with messages. Unlike before, these weren't angry or manipulative. They were desperate. She claimed she was blindsided by the divorce filing. Despite our explicit conversation, she insisted she deserved a chance to explain herself fully and begged for couples counseling. When these messages went unanswered, her friends began calling me, claiming she was in a dangerous emotional state. I recognized the tactic immediately, creating an emergency to force contact. I responded only to her closest friend, calmly explaining that while I sympathized with her distress, I could no longer be responsible for her emotional well-being. I suggested professional help and ended the call. Minutes later, my wife texted that she was outside my new apartment. Somehow she had tracked down my address. Looking through the peephole, I saw her leaning against the wall in the hallway, mascara streaking down her face. For a moment, my resolve wavered. Despite everything, seeing her in pain still affected me. But then I remembered her words, "I feel no shame," and the cold calculation behind her tears. I didn't open the door. Eventually she left, sliding a handwritten letter underneath. I didn't read it immediately, placing it in a folder with the other documentation of our separation. The next day I was blindsided when my boss called me into his office. Apparently my wife had contacted him, claiming I was having a mental breakdown and misappropriating company resources. She had specifically mentioned the emergency leave I had taken. The accusation was baseless, but it required explanation. Reluctantly, I shared the basics of my situation with him. To my surprise, his expression softened with understanding. "Take whatever time you need," he said, "and let me know if you need a recommendation for a good attorney." It was the first genuine support I had felt in weeks. That evening I finally read her letter. It was 8 pages of meandering justifications, claiming she had been in a dark place when the affairs happened, that she had been seeking validation due to childhood trauma, that she had always loved me despite her actions. There was a desperation to the writing, words heavily underlined, entire paragraphs in all capitals. The letter ended with a proposal. She would agree to the divorce quietly if I gave her the house and half of my retirement savings, substantially more than she would be legally entitled to given the circumstances. The attempt at emotional manipulation followed by financial extortion clarified any lingering doubts I might have had. This was who she truly was, and perhaps who she had always been. I forwarded the letter to my attorney, who added it to our file as evidence of attempted coercion. When I didn't respond to her offer, she escalated again, this time contacting my parents. They arrived at my apartment, unannounced, concerned by what she had told them, that I was refusing all communication and threatening to leave her destitute. With a calm I didn't know I possessed, I showed them the evidence of her affairs and manipulations. Their shock turned to quiet anger on my behalf. My father, usually reserved with his emotions, put his hand on my shoulder and said simply, "You're doing the right thing, son." Their validation broke something in me, and for the first time since discovering the affair, I allowed myself to truly grieve in their presence. As they were leaving, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was short. "You should know you weren't the only one she was lying to." Attached was a screenshot of a conversation between my wife and yet another man, dated just 2 weeks ago. The message came from his wife, who had discovered their correspondence in much the same way I had. We agreed to meet the following day to compare notes. What had begun as a painful personal betrayal was revealing itself to be something far more calculated and extensive than I had initially understood. Meeting with the other betrayed spouse changed everything. We sat across from each other at a quiet coffee shop, both exhausted from sleepless nights and the constant vigilance that betrayal forces upon you. She was poised and articulate, a successful attorney who had been married for 6 years. As we compared timelines and messages, patterns emerged that chilled me to the core. My wife's affairs weren't just opportunistic indiscretions, they were calculated campaigns. The woman shared evidence that my wife and her husband had established burner phones, created elaborate alibis, and even coordinated their stories when suspicions arose. More disturbing was the discovery that they had met through an online forum specifically for married people seeking affairs. This wasn't impulsive behavior. It was deliberate deception as a lifestyle choice. "I found messages where they discussed techniques to gaslight us," she said quietly, sliding her phone across the table. "They turned it into a game." Reading their exchanges made me physically ill. My wife had shared intimate details about our therapy sessions, using the vulnerabilities I had exposed in counseling to better manipulate me. They had laughed about my attempts to revitalize our marriage, mocking the romantic gestures I had made during periods when I had subconsciously sensed something was wrong. The attorney and I agreed to share information moving forward. Our cases strengthened each other's positions. When I returned to my apartment, I found divorce papers taped to my door. She had filed a counter-petition. Her version painted her as the victim of emotional abandonment, who had made a single mistake after years of neglect. The document requested permanent spousal support, ownership of our house, and half of all assets, including my family inheritance that had been carefully kept separate from marital funds. Her attorney had constructed a narrative so divorced from reality that it would have been laughable if it weren't so calculated. My own attorney was unfazed. "This is standard operating procedure for someone who knows they're in a weak position," he explained. "They start with outrageous demands, hoping to settle somewhere in the middle. We won't be settling." He filed our response the same day, including evidence from both affairs. The legal clock was now officially ticking. That weekend, I received a series of missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails revealed they were from mutual friends, some sounding concerned, others accusatory. It became clear my wife had launched a preemptive social campaign, controlling the narrative by painting herself as remorseful and me as unforgiving. One friend left a particularly troubling message. She told us everything, how she made one mistake and you're trying to destroy her life over it. "She's a mess, man. Just talk to her." I didn't respond immediately, taking time to craft careful, factual replies. I didn't share explicit details or evidence that would have been destructive rather than constructive. But I calmly stated that there were aspects of the situation they weren't aware of, and that while I appreciated their concern, this was a private matter that would be resolved legally. Most didn't reply, but a few sent brief acknowledgments. The silence was its own kind of answer. On Monday morning, I arrived at work to find a delivery of flowers at reception, my wife's attempt to create a public spectacle of reconciliation. The card read, "I'll wait for you to remember what we had. Forever yours." My colleagues' curious glances made it clear this was exactly the kind of public pressure she had intended. I donated the arrangement to a nearby nursing home and requested that reception not accept further deliveries. That afternoon, I received an email from her with the subject line, "Please." Attached was a document containing scanned pages from her journal detailing her supposed emotional turmoil over the affairs. The entries were conveniently dated over the past week, after being caught, and described overwhelming guilt and self-loathing. The performative nature of the gesture was transparent. These weren't private reflections, but carefully crafted props meant to be shared as evidence of her remorse. As days passed, her tactics grew increasingly erratic. She appeared at my gym during my regular workout time, then at the grocery store I frequented, each time creating scenes of tearful apologies that drew attention from strangers. When these public appeals failed, she shifted to financial warfare, canceling utilities at our house that were still in my name and attempting to max out credit cards before they could be frozen in the divorce proceedings. Each move was documented and added to our case file. The turning point came 6 weeks after my initial discovery. I received a call from her coworker, the same one whose messages I had first seen that fateful night. His voice was hesitant, uncomfortable. "Look, I don't want to get involved, but she's been telling people at work that you were abusive throughout your marriage. She's showing photos of bruises, claiming you attacked her when you found out about us." My blood ran cold at the implication. "I know it's not true," he continued. "She told me you never even raised your voice during the confrontation. I can't be part of this lie." His conscience had finally surfaced, and with it came a flood of new information. He forwarded emails and screenshots documenting her extensive planning, including researching divorce laws to identify what evidence would be most damaging to me. Most crucially, he provided a time-stamped video she had sent him the night of our confrontation, laughing about how easily she had manipulated me for years. In the background, our wedding photo was visible on the wall, a jarring juxtaposition that encapsulated the entire betrayal. This final piece of evidence would prove decisive in the legal proceedings to come. The false abuse allegations changed the tenor of our divorce overnight. My attorney immediately filed for an emergency hearing, presenting the coworker's evidence along with video footage from my apartment building security cameras. The timestamps clearly showed I was nowhere near our house when she claimed the supposed attack occurred. Her attorney, upon reviewing our evidence, requested a private meeting with her before proceeding. When they emerged from the conference room, the change in her demeanor was visible. Her false claims were withdrawn with a clinical statement about misunderstandings due to emotional distress. The judge was not impressed. Looking directly at my wife, he issued a stern warning about the consequences of perjury and false allegations in his courtroom. For the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes as she realized her usual tactics wouldn't work in this venue. The hearing concluded with temporary orders heavily favoring my position and an accelerated timeline for the divorce proceedings. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt the first hints of closure beginning to form. That evening, my phone lit up with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "We need to talk about your wife." It was from another man, someone I had never met or heard of, who had been involved with her 2 years earlier. He had seen her name in court records while researching his own divorce case and recognized her pattern of behavior. Over coffee the next day, he described a relationship that mirrored aspects of my own marriage with uncanny precision. The same love bombing in the beginning, the same gradual erosion of boundaries, the same gaslighting when questions arose. "She has a playbook," he explained, "and she runs it like a professional." As word spread through our social circles about the failed abuse allegations, the tide of public opinion shifted dramatically. Friends who had initially supported her based on her version of events now approached me with apologies and concern. I accepted these reconnections carefully, understanding that many had been manipulated just as I had been. Several revealed that she had borrowed substantial sums of money from them during our marriage, using stories about my supposed financial control as justification. These friends were now filing their own legal claims against her. 3 months into the separation, I began the hard work of rebuilding. I started therapy with a specialist in post-betrayal trauma, joined a support group for divorced professionals, and reconnected with hobbies I had abandoned during my marriage. Slowly, painfully, I began to recognize how isolated I had become under her influence. Friends I hadn't spoken with in years revealed they had been deliberately pushed away through subtle manipulations. Rumors spread by my wife, invitations accidentally not delivered, text messages from them that I had never received. My wife's facade continued to crumble in other areas of her life. Her company placed her on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into inappropriate workplace relationships. Apparently, the coworker wasn't the only colleague she had been involved with. Her carefully constructed, professional image was disintegrating as quickly as her personal one. Through mutual connections, I heard she had moved in with her parents, claiming financial hardship despite her substantial salary and the temporary support she was receiving from me as required by the court. The most revealing moment came when her closest friend, the same one who had called me concerned about her emotional state early in the separation, reached out to meet. Over dinner, she confessed that she had been aware of the affairs for years, having reluctantly covered for my wife on numerous occasions. She always had a justification, she explained, not meeting my eyes, and she was so convincing about how you somehow deserved it. Now, having seen the extent of the manipulation unfold, she was consumed with guilt for her complicity. "There's something else you should know," she said finally, pulling out her phone. "She's been planning this for longer than you realize." She showed me emails from over a year ago where my wife had discussed divorce strategies, including ways to maximize financial gain and minimize consequences for her infidelity. The friend had saved these messages, troubled by their calculation but unsure what to do with the information. Now she offered them as evidence for my case and as an apology for her silence. As the divorce proceedings advanced, my wife's attorney approached mine about settlement. Her initial demands had been reduced to requests, then to suggestions, and finally to acceptance of basic terms. The evidence against her was overwhelming, her credibility with the court non-existent, and her financial position weakening as her professional misconduct investigation continued. The settlement we ultimately reached was far more favorable than even my attorney had initially hoped for, requiring no ongoing contact or financial entanglement. The night before the final hearing, I revisited the hotel where I had stayed that first night after discovering her betrayal. Sitting at the same bar, I ordered the same drink and reflected on the 5 months that had passed since that moment. The pain hadn't disappeared, but its character had changed. What once felt like a gaping wound now resembled a healing scar, still tender but no longer threatening to consume me. I scrolled through recent photos on my phone, a hiking trip with reconnected friends, dinner with my parents, my new apartment fully furnished in a style that was entirely my own. These images contained no reminders of her, no shadows of our shared past. They represented something I had feared I would never find again, a future that held promise rather than pain. My phone buzzed with a final text from her. "I hope you know what you're throwing away. This is your last chance." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Tomorrow would bring legal closure to a chapter of my life that had already emotionally ended the moment she uttered those fateful words. I feel no shame. Everything since had merely been epilogue, necessary processes to reach this moment of authentic freedom. The final hearing arrived with a strange sense of anticlimactic certainty. After months of legal maneuvering, evidence gathering, and emotional turbulence, the actual dissolution of our marriage would take less than 30 minutes in a nearly empty courtroom. I arrived early, dressed in a new suit I had purchased specifically for this day, something that represented the professional and personal rebirth I was experiencing rather than a reminder of my married life. My attorney met me at the courthouse steps, reviewing the procedure one last time. The settlement had been agreed upon, the papers prepared. This was merely the formal conclusion to a process that had been functionally complete for weeks. She requested to make a statement to the court, he mentioned casually. The judge allowed it, but it won't affect the outcome. I nodded, unsurprised by this final attempt to control the narrative. We took our places in the courtroom. I deliberately kept my eyes forward when she entered. My attorney had warned me about maintaining composure regardless of provocations, but I found I didn't need the reminder. The emotional hold she once had over me had disintegrated through repeated exposure to her true nature. Still, I sensed, rather than saw her trying to catch my eye, she took her seat across the aisle. Close enough that I caught the familiar scent of her perfume. A detail that once would have triggered nostalgia but now registered as merely another data point. When I finally did look at her during the judge's preliminary remarks, I was struck by the transformation. Gone was the confident, polished professional who had dominated boardrooms and social gatherings. In her place sat someone who had meticulously constructed an image of vulnerability. She had lost weight, darkened her hair, and chosen an austere outfit that contrasted sharply with her usual stylish appearance. Even her posture communicated defeat. It was a carefully choreographed performance for the judge, crafted by someone who still believed appearances could override reality. The proceedings moved quickly through the technical aspects. Assets were formally divided. The house would be sold with proceeds split according to our agreement, and no ongoing spousal support would be required from either party. When asked if we understood and accepted the terms, our voices overlapped with identical affirmations, a final moment of unintentional synchronicity that felt bitterly appropriate. Then came her requested statement. The judge reminded her that this was merely a formality and would not impact the court's decision before giving her the floor. She rose slowly, clutching a folded piece of paper that trembled slightly in her hands. For a moment, I glimpsed genuine emotion breaking through her calculated facade, the realization that her actions had consequences no amount of manipulation could undo. "Your Honor," she began, her voice softer than I had heard it in years. "I recognize that this marriage cannot be saved, but I want the record to show my deep remorse for the pain I've caused." She turned slightly toward me, though I maintained my gaze on the judge. "The person I became in this marriage is not who I truly am. I lost myself and made terrible choices that hurt someone who deserved only honesty and faithfulness." The performance continued for several minutes, a masterclass in what might have seemed like genuine contrition to anyone who hadn't witnessed her previous manipulations. She referenced therapy she was undertaking, insights she had gained about her behavior patterns, and her hopes that we might someday find a way to forgive each other. What struck me most was how, even in this final moment, she equated my discovery of her betrayal with her years of deception, as if we had somehow equally wronged each other. When she finished, the courtroom fell silent. The judge thanked her for her statement and asked if I wished to respond. My attorney had prepared remarks focusing on moving forward, rather than dwelling on past grievances, but as I stood, I realized I didn't need them. "No, Your Honor," I said simply. "I have nothing to add." The flash of surprise, and perhaps disappointment, in her eyes confirmed this wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. She had expected either anger she could frame as vindictiveness or emotion she could interpret as lingering attachment. My quiet acceptance denied her both. The judge signed the final decree, and just like that, a decade-long relationship was legally terminated. As we rose for the judge's exit, my now ex-wife approached me directly for the first time that day. "Can we talk?" she whispered urgently. "Just for a minute, please." Her hand moved toward my arm but stopped short of touching me. Her eyes were wet with tears that perhaps were finally genuine. For a brief moment, I saw not the manipulator of recent months, but glimpses of the woman I had once believed her to be. I hesitated, then nodded, following her to a quiet alcove outside the courtroom. I meant what I said in there, she began, wiping carefully at her eyes. I am sorry, truly. I know you probably don't believe that, but… She paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. I just need to know if there's any part of you that might someday be able to forgive me. Looking at her, I realized something profound had shifted within me. The question would have devastated me months ago, triggering either false hope or renewed anger. Now it simply felt irrelevant to the life I was building. Forgiveness isn't something I'm thinking about right now, I answered honestly. Maybe someday. But that would be for my peace, not yours. Her face crumpled slightly at the response. I understand, she said, though her expression suggested otherwise. I just want you to know that despite everything, what we had was real for me, at least in the beginning. She reached into her purse and extracted a small velvet box, the one that had contained her engagement ring. I thought you should have this back. It belongs in your family. As I accepted the box, our fingers briefly touched, and I felt nothing. No electricity, no pain, no nostalgia. Just the simple transaction of returning property. Thank you, I said, pocketing the heirloom ring that had been my grandmother's. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before she spoke again. Will you be okay? She asked, the question so incongruous with everything that had transpired that I almost laughed. Yes, I replied with a certainty that surprised even me. I already am. And as I walked away from her for the final time, I realized it was true. The morning tears she had shed in court couldn't save our marriage, not because I was unforgiving, but because there was nothing left to save. The relationship had ended months ago with 5 simple words spoken without remorse. I feel no shame. Everything since had merely been epilogue, necessary processes to reach this moment of authentic freedom. Outside the courthouse, spring sunshine bathed the steps in golden light. I loosened my tie, took a deep breath of fresh air, and felt the weight of the past finally lift from my shoulders. Ahead lay uncertainties, challenges, and inevitable moments of loneliness, but also possibilities that had been unimaginable, within the confines of a relationship built on deception. I descended the steps not as half of a failed marriage, but as someone whole for the first time in a decade. And in that moment, that was enough.